Your ability to live your best life is directly proportional to your ability to stick to your guns. We are back with another episode that actually kind of relates to the last episode about the art of spiritual manifestation, because I ended that with the fact that sometimes you need to do something, and that something that you need to do doesn't always feel comfortable. It doesn't even always feel like it makes sense. And I think off the back of that, some of you might be thinking like, okay, I know I need to do this thing. Like, how can I do it? I'm just so afraid. So this episode is for people like you. This episode is for people that are too afraid to make a move in any specific area in their life. We're going to unpack that. And hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll feel empowered to take action immediately if you're able to. If not, the next day, the next week, but as soon as you possibly can. There are a couple of times in life where we feel like we actually need to say the weird thing or do the weird thing or just like do something that we didn't expect someone like us to do. And that can be really overwhelming. It can feel like life or death. Even if it's not necessarily physical life or death, it can feel like a reputational life or death. It may feel like we're going to run the risk of being rejected by that person that we want a certain type of relationship with. It may be the risk of being embarrassed in front of your colleagues or co-workers or being alienated by them. These are all kind of the metaphorical and the mini life or death type situations that we face daily when we're faced with this moment that we need to do something, we need to act, but we're just afraid. And I'm not here to shade anyone who's afraid or to judge you, because we all face this. What we're going to do is try and help you to get unstuck from that fear and turn that into an action that has the power to not just change your life, but change other people's. So let's start with privilege. Let's start with enjoyment, because privilege and enjoyment are extremely sweet. When you're just lapping it up, you're experiencing it, it's great, and you're like loving it, right? So I have recently been reading and rereading the story of Esther, Queen Esther. Very quickly, Queen Esther is a young Hebrew woman who basically becomes the king's wife. And she comes into this incredible position of power when people in her ethnic group didn't necessarily have like access to that kind of royalty in the country that she was living in. And I was enjoying the story, you know, this young girl who kind of basically got plucked from obscurity and now is like in the highest position in the land. Like, yes, soak it in, like, let me get some of that energy too. However, within a few months, or I think within a year, she's faced with this big risk. She's faced with a big life-changing decision that she needs to really act on, right? So she is now in this position where she has the ear of the king. She's a very influential woman. She is the queen of the country. And her people, as I mentioned, her ethnic group, they are facing what is essentially like prejudice, and someone wants to kind of wipe them out. So her relative, who's kind of like her mentor, is relaying this plot to her and saying, you know, this is what he's planning to do. He's planning to wipe us all out. And I think we need your help, and you need to talk to the king. Now, while she's the queen, it doesn't mean that her marriage was like maybe how a modern marriage would be, where you could just go up to your partner and ask them for anything. You could not necessarily speak directly to the king without his like favor or his invitation, and also what she was asking was also potentially risky, right? So that she's kind of actually in a life or death situation at this point. So she's umming and ahhing about whether I should do it, because if you approach the king without being invited, you face death. Unless he just decides that once you've approached him, he just decides, actually, I'm going to put my scepter on you and I'm happy for you to approach me. But you only know that once you've done it. You don't know it beforehand. So it's quite risky. And her relative Mordecai says to her, and what is quite a popular phrase, and I've even seen it on like Pinterest, and he says to her that if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, maybe you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now, when this phrase, especially the latter part of it, which is basically, maybe you're in this position for such a time as this, I've always heard that as a very like aspirational phrase, you know, this is your moment. That was the energy of it. This is your moment. You're ready for such a time as this, you know, you've been brought for this. But actually, this was a statement that highlighted the fact that your privilege that you had of being the king's favorite, being the most beautiful, being selected to become queen, all of this stuff, which you were enjoying, being rich, all these things, that's great. But the point of your privilege was not for that. The point of your privilege was that when this need came up, you could fill it, and you could fill it more effectively than anybody else could. And I thought that was just such an interesting thought, because personally, I was kind of going through this moment of like, should I talk about certain things in certain spaces? I was kind of retracting a bit, retracting as I felt like certain areas in my life were flourishing and becoming, let's say, more privileged, just because I've been talking about privilege in this. And I was like, oh, I don't really want to, like, as that's flourishing, I don't want to rock the boat of that flourishing for this other thing that I need to be doing. That was my internal conversation that was happening over the last couple of months, way before I even got to reading this book. And I was reading this book for a whole different reason, which is just funny how life works, right? And it really struck me, and I thought, what if the flourishing in this area of your life that's really happening, that you're loving, what if the part of that, what if the reason why that is going so well is because you're also called to do this thing that you are afraid of? You're afraid of, like I talked about, the mini life or death moments. You're afraid of the reputational risk it might cause. You're afraid of, I mentioned, one of the examples I mentioned earlier was like no longer being the cool girl or guy. You're like afraid of like that, But what if all of this privilege that you think, all of this flourishing that you think is just for your own enjoyment, which it might, your enjoyment is definitely part of it, but it's definitely not the whole thing, especially when you're following a path of purpose. What if you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? And that really opened my mind, because when we talk about being afraid to take a particular risk or to step into something, we normally think quite micro. We normally think for us, we normally think, okay, if I take this risk, it's going to mean this for me. Maybe it will mean this for maybe my immediate family as well, but most of us will think about it in that very small scale. But actually, the thing that you're fearful of could have an impact that goes far beyond the immediate people that you're thinking of, that it was for a bigger purpose. And in a couple of episodes ago, I spoke about this with Joseph, that the thing that his brothers intended for evil against him was actually for good, not just for him to become prime minister and be able to have all this stuff, but for the saving of many lives, right? So all of what he went through was not just so he could have this great story of like, look at what bad people did to me and now I'm out on top. No, it was for the saving of many lives. In the same way, what if Esther had come to her royal position, not just so that she could be the most pampered woman in the country, but so that she could also step in a place where people were going to be wiped out, right? Again, what if the skill that you have that has brought you so much good fortune, what if that privilege exists for something else, that other thing that you're on the sidelines about, that you're afraid to run the risk of your reputation or your coolness or looking like a weirdo or all these things? What if you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Now, the flip side of that is at the beginning, which is Mordecai, her relative, says to her, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish, right? So we now see the flip side of if we don't take the risk, right? So we know that, okay, what if I am actually in this position for this moment that can help other people, which we probably are because we're all interconnected. But if you don't do it, it's going to get done, which I think is such an interesting thought, right? Because many of us say, I had this idea for this business, or I had this idea for this project, didn't do it, and I've seen someone else do it. Because for the most part, God is looking for people to partner with him on something. But if God wants something to happen, it's going to happen. Whether you want to opt in or not, it's up to you. But that is the journey, but that will dictate the journey of your life, but it won't necessarily stop the thing from taking place. So in this moment, it says, if you remain silent, relief and deliverance will come somewhere else, but you and your father's family will perish. So like, there's this really interesting tension of like, the purpose will be fulfilled, but that microcosm that you were trying to protect could still be at risk. And I just want to throw that out there for you, because I think so much of modern, maybe Western, maybe privileged life is that the thing that paralyzes us the most is what people will think of us. And I have to ask you, is it worth it? Is it worth you not doing it, someone else getting it done, and it never benefiting you in the long run? Is it worth knowing that you have left your potential, the potential that you were appointed to for such a time as this, because you're afraid of what someone thinks? So that's the first thought, just a thought, let it marinate, linger on it. The next thing that I think is an important thing to remember when you're on that kind of like tightrope of trying to decide whether you should take this reputational risk or take this emotional risk or take this psychological risk, whatever the risk may be, is that if you are called to do it, if it's in alignment, as we spoke about in the last episode, then the payoff is actually promised. So if you search one of our earlier episodes, I spoke about the antidote to imposter syndrome. It's also called growth is guaranteed. And in that, I spoke about this idea that we are given things in life with the expectation that they're going to do well, that it's actually going to be fruitful. and successful. Now, fruitful and success doesn't mean easy all the time, but it will bear the fruit that it needs to bear, right? And I think this idea is repeated in this moment when you are thinking and you're weighing up whether you should go for that thing that may make you look stupid or may make you look a certain type of way. And the first thing is, before I even get into why it's promised, I want to think about where the promise is coming from. Because for me, especially when I was thinking about, oh, I don't want to do this thing because it's going to make me look a certain type of way, what are people going to think? You have to ask yourself, do I care more about what people think, or do I care about honoring the source from which this thing even came? Now, hang on, I feel like I'm not explaining that properly, so let me get into it a little bit deeper, right? So for me, I know that so much of the successful moments of my life, the incredible moments that people see, were triggered and inspired by God. So now that I feel like my life is in alignment and God is calling me to do this scary thing, am I going to stop because of what I think people are going to say? I don't even know what people are going to say, but am I going to stop at what I think people are going to say? Or am I going to honor the fact that God actually made this happen in the first place? So if this is what God wants, maybe I should continue to do it, even if it's a risk, right? And this is something that, you know, like Jesus also talks about in the New Testament. You know, he says that anybody who's willing to follow him and let go of the comforts of the life they knew before, which in this case he's using to illustrate like letting go of like family members and fields, which fields represent kind of like money and business, is basically if you're willing to let go of the comfort of the status quo. I don't think it's necessarily Jesus saying like you need to hate all your family members, which I think people take to the extreme. It's more about him saying that those who are willing to step out of the comfort zone of the status quo will not fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, i.e. in the life that they're living now, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. So he's basically saying that the things that you think you're about to sacrifice, you're actually going to get them paid back to you even more. Like, that's what I say, the payoff is actually promised. They're actually going to come back to you way, way more than you even thought. Now, there may be a bit of trouble that comes with them. Let's not get it twisted. Let's not get it wrong, because life is life. And, you know, we live in a fallen world and stuff. But the thing that you think you're holding on to for dear life, your reputation, your coolness, your ability to not rock the boat, your respect, the ability to keep up with the Joneses, your social status, you're going to get 100-fold of that if you're willing to leave it and do the scary thing, do the weird thing, say the weird thing, do whatever is required of you to align in the journey of life that you feel like you're being called to. And I think it's really important that we embrace that truth, that we learn to internalize that truth. And the only way you can internalize something is to just continually repeat it, think about it, and like say it to yourself. You know, I always talk about neuro-linguistic programming. You say it to yourself so that you remember that this is the truth. The truth isn't that if I take this risk, my life is over. The truth is that if I take this risk, my life expands 100-fold. Now, there may be challenges that come with it, but the payoff is promised. It makes me ask myself, like, how could I ever have been shy or retiring about a particular thing that I think God is calling me to, when it's God that was the reason I have anything in the first place, right? And I don't have a single thing without this journey that God has put me on. So let me not forget that, and let me take the risk, because I'm thinking of all the bad things that could happen when there is 100-fold of the things that I thought I left behind, the good things that I thought I left behind. They can all come back. They will all come back. It's not even that they can, they will all come back. So again, when we talk about internalizing those truths and being able to step across the threshold from fear into action, I want to give you a couple of thoughts that are critical from what I've observed to actually making that happen, right? There is a phrase that I love that I forget. I'm not gonna lie, I actually forget this phrase a lot. And then when I remember it, I'm like, oh, duh, like, why have I not been living my life in this way? And it's Hebrews 10:38, and it shows up in many other places, but Hebrews 10:38 says, my righteous, so it's God speaking, my righteous will live by faith, and I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Now, we're talking about fear a lot in this episode, and it's there in black and white, God saying it in multiple. There are various other verses across the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, that have this same phrase, that the righteous shall live by faith. And I have no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. That bit's in Hebrews. And when I read that, I'm like, ooh, I'm like, okay, I've got it. Like, I get your point. Like, please, like, you don't have to call me out in this way, because it challenges me immediately to think, am I actually living by faith, or am I shrinking back? Because when you are sitting on the sidelines because you want to retain your reputation, you're scared of rocking the boat, you're scared of looking like the weirdo, etc., 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 you are shrinking back. And that is not the life. That is not a bold life. That's not a victorious life. That's not a life of impact. That's not a life of effectiveness. That is not a life that you will even fully enjoy. And I do believe that, yes, we're meant to be impactful and we're meant to do all these great things, but our life is actually to be well lived in whatever capacity that means to us. And you are cutting off the lifespan, you're cutting off your capacity for joy, you're cutting off your capacity for abundance because you've sat on the sidelines and you've tried to save face. You might have heard this phrase before. Actually, a lot of the things I've mentioned in this particular episode aren't like very niche references in the Bible. They're quite common. They've been, turned into graphics and paintings and put on t-shirts. And I think when that happens, we can forget what they mean or they can lose their meaning. So I want to just double back and go into it in depth where it says, the righteous shall live by faith, right? So when I looked at that word, I thought, do I know what faith really means? Because when we talk about faith in like general culture, we make it sound like blind faith. Like you just wake up one day and you're like, yeah, I believe it and I'm just going to jump. And it's like, I don't believe that we're called to just be reckless and like people talk about, just have blind faith. What does that mean? Like, I like to use my mind and my brain. What does that mean? I don't believe that faith is just like this random thing that you just wake up and start believing things. That's how people get distracted. That's how people get abused. That's how people get, controlled. And we've seen that happen many, many times in many different types of spiritual and religious circles. So I was like, let me look at what that means. What does that word actually mean? And there's this really good resource, I'll put it in the show notes, Blue Letter Bible, that helps you get to the original meaning of the text. Because of course, when we read the Bible, if you're not reading the Old Testament in Hebrew and you're not reading the New Testament in Greek, it's not the original translation. So I'm always, being the English literature like obsessee that I am, I always try to understand like, what do these words mean? Because words actually mean things. And I think sometimes we get carried away with what someone has told us something means or what we've implied. So I'm always like, okay, if I read something and I'm like, this verse like makes sense, or this verse is interesting to me, or this verse isn't interesting to me, or I disagree with it, or I don't understand it, I will try and like look at the original wording. So the original meaning of this faith word is faithfulness, which is emunah in original Hebrew, and it means firmness, fidelity, steadfastness, and steadiness. So my question to you is, when you heard the righteous shall live by faith, did you think firmness? Did you think steadfastness? Did you think fidelity? Did you think steadiness? Or did you think faith, just like throwing caution to the wind and going for it? Which one did you think? Because I think sometimes we might be thinking it's the latter when actually it's the former, the firmness, fidelity, and steadfastness. And that brings a whole new meaning to the entire like phrase. The righteous shall live by firmness. The righteous shall live by steadfastness. The righteous, and righteous basically means like you're like aligned with God, you're right with God. And we can, if you have questions, I can explain like different examples of what that means, but we're doubling down on this word by faith. So those who are aligned with God will live by faith, faith being firmness, fidelity, steadiness, and steadfastness. And those words don't speak to throwing caution to the wind. Those words speak to kicking your heels into the ground. Those words speak to anchoring yourself. Those words speak to, we are riding or dying. We are riding out. Those words speak to, I am going to sit here and be faithful to this specific thing and be firm in my journey until the end. That's what that speaks to. And I don't think that's what we necessarily always think of when we hear the word like faith. But it makes sense because faith and faithful obviously have a similar root, right? And again, one thing I will quickly say is that sometimes words are translated to the same English word in like the English Bible that may have a different Hebrew root. So there may be verses that you've seen that talk about faith and actually it doesn't have this emunah word as the original root. So just check that. Just be aware of like that. But when we start to use this language of firmness and fidelity and steadfastness, you start to realize that that speaks to an ongoing commitment. That speaks to a choice that you've made on one day, and that you're sticking to, rain or shine, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, till death do us part. Like it's giving marriage vows. And that's what the faithfulness of that marriage relationship also is representing, right? You've made a vow on one day and you have stuck to it. And I think that shows us that like a flourishing life is determined by how much you're willing to stick to your guns, how much you're willing to be consistent, even when life doesn't look like it's favoring you, even when you're afraid, even when not everybody around you understands. Your ability to live your best life is directly proportional to your ability to stick to your guns, to stick to what you originally set out to do. So from this, we see that faith isn't wishy-washy. It's not this like, oh, I just believe and I'm just gonna follow it. Like, no, it's not a whim. It's not a funny feeling, because feelings can dissipate when times get hard. It's not about that. It's a choice, and it's a choice that we stick to. And I find this idea of like firmness really interesting, because you can only know that something is firm and something is steadfast when there has been pressure, or when something has threatened its stability, right? So if you're facing something that makes you feel afraid, and if you're facing something that makes you feel like, oh, should I do this? That is that you are in the middle of a test of your faithfulness. Your faithfulness, your strength, your firmness, your commitment to the cause is going to be shown in your ability to withstand that fear. So sometimes we think that faithfulness and like going for it and following your purpose is the absence of like being afraid, but it's actually doing things in spite of the fear. You can imagine it as like your faithfulness is like a physical like foundation. And if you're listening, you'll see that on YouTube. I've just picked up something near me. And this is like a foundation. This is your faithfulness. And what happens is like, what I should probably do is put a pencil on it. So you've got something that's shaking, you know, it can be like, let's say there's like an earthquake. It's shaking. All the other stuff is falling off. Things are shaking, but the foundation remains the same. That is an expression of what it means when you are in your purpose and you're following things even in moments that threaten your peace and that make you feel afraid. So if we think back to Esther, you know, her journey of life was to continue to be like a good, let's say one of her callings was to be a good leader. As a queen of a nation, your leadership role is to also influence the choices of the king. The queens had a lot of influence over their husbands, but also as a representative of your ethnic group in a place where they were foreigners, you also had an implicit leadership role because you rose to the highest position in the land. You can't forget your people. So in that time of like fear, that, and her time was literally life or death, she rose to the occasion and she stayed steadfast and firm to her calling as a leader, period. As a leader in the home, as a leader to those people, and as a leader maybe in other capacities as well. Your firmness and your faithfulness, your steadfastness is proven in the raging winds. It's proven in the changing times. It's proven in the changing opinions. It's all proven in these moments of like feeling wobbly but standing firm through it all. Through this, I understood now that faith is not an act. Faith is a continued act every single day. This idea we speak, you know, on various occasions, especially in like these religious circles around like daily bread and stuff like that. And that's what this is. It's like a daily practice. I'm really fascinated by this idea that life takes constant work and maintenance. And I think it's that idea that every day is like a discrete moment to really reaffirm what you learned yesterday. Like you can't bank up your faith from yesterday into today. You can use it as a muscle, but like kind of like with physical muscles, if you don't use them, they dissipate, right? So you could have built up this like big muscle for the last 90 days, and if after 10 days you're not using it, it's going to get weaker. It's that kind of thing. And when we talk about the future, sometimes we just want that like one thing that's going to give us an assurance that helps us stay steady for the next like 20 years of our life. And it's like, that's just not how things work. When we try and look for a specific thing that is going to guarantee us an easy life for the next 20 years, we're looking for a cheat code. The desire to know the future is us trying to find a cheat code for why we should remain faithful to the journey. And even if we do have an inkling of what the future looks like, the real work and what it takes to really get there is our ability to be faithful today. And then when tomorrow comes, be faithful to tomorrow when tomorrow comes, and then the next day and the next day and the next day. That's how it all works. I wanted to kind of like wrap this up with a couple of verses that I thought would be super helpful in this respect, because I think the ability to kind of stay like consistent is just how much you're able to train your brain. It's really that simple. I am trying to find the verse in here. Don't watch my Bible. It's very old school because I've had it for like 10 years and I've ripped it apart. There's a lot going on in here. Okay, so I found it. So I wanted to leave you with this phrase, a couple of phrases. So don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere. so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what has been promised. So that's number one. Don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Don't throw it away. Don't throw it away. Just keep telling yourself, don't throw away your confidence. It'll be richly rewarded. And the other one that I wanted to leave you with was Joshua at the beginning, because basically, didn't plan on going into this because we're wrapping up. But at the beginning, basically, Joshua, quick context, Joshua's like the mentee of Moses, and Moses dies, and he's been leading this whole country through a series, through the desert to get to the promised land, right? And Moses dies, and now Joshua's like taking up this leadership role. So when we step into big leadership roles, that's actually very scary as well, because you're like, can I actually do this? Like, the person who was teaching me is now gone. Like, do I really have what it takes? You know, all those questions. And it's a whole new phase as well. He's not continuing a space that they were in, they're actually entering a completely new space. And in Joshua 1:9 it says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid and don't be discouraged, for the Lord God will be with you wherever you go. And I love that verse. I actually love a lot of that whole beginning of Joshua, the book of Joshua and the story of Joshua. But it says it a couple of times, be strong and courageous. If you've been called to this moment, even if the projects seems huge, even if it feels like you're just scaling a huge mountain and you're just at the bottom of it, if you feel like you are afraid to look funny and you don't want to look like a fool, be strong and courageous. Don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. Just don't give up. And who knows, maybe you have come to your privileged position for such a time as this. Thank you for watching, as always. Appreciate you guys being here. Let me know your thoughts, feedback. You may not know this, but you can actually leave comments in Spotify podcasts and obviously on the YouTube comments as well. So let me know thoughts, how it's going for you. Continue to share this with people in your world, and I will speak to you in the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to catch the live updates that are coming in the weeks where there's no podcast. There's a live update in the show notes. So make sure you sign up to the newsletter, and I will speak to you very soon.